I read my wife's diary. What she wrote about our son left me speechless. There's always something a little private about a person's diary, but when I accidentally stumbled upon my wife's personal journal, I never imagined the bombshell I would find about our son. What she wrote left me speechless, and honestly, I still don't know how to react. Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. It was one of those nights where I couldn't sleep. The house was unusually quiet, and I was awake, tossing and turning in bed. My mind was running wild, replaying everything that had happened over the past few months. My son, Caleb, had been acting differently lately. At first, I thought it was just a phase, maybe the typical teenage rebellion, but it felt like there was more to it. It wasn't just his behavior, it was how distant he'd become. I had this feeling that something was off, but I wasn't sure what. So, in the middle of the night, while my wife was in another room, I made a decision that would change everything. I would read her diary. She'd always kept one, a way to jot down her thoughts, but it was something I never thought of intruding on. I knew it wasn't the right thing to do, but in that moment, I just couldn't shake the feeling that I needed answers. So I found it, hidden under a stack of books on her desk. With my heart racing, I flipped open the first page and started reading. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't what I found. The more I read, the more my stomach dropped, especially when I came to a section about Caleb. I could hardly believe what I was reading. My wife had written about Caleb in a way I never thought possible. She described his behavior in a way that was shocking and emotional, much more than I had ever seen before. She mentioned how he'd been shutting himself off from both of us, how he barely spoke at the dinner table anymore, and how, despite all of her attempts to reach him, he was becoming more and more withdrawn. But it wasn't just the distance that made my heart drop. It was her words about why she thought he was acting that way. She believed Caleb was struggling with something far deeper than teenage angst. Her writing hinted at a feeling that perhaps Caleb didn't feel like he belonged in our family, like he was an outsider in a home where everyone else seemed to be getting along. My wife spoke about how she feared he was feeling unloved, and it broke her heart. I felt a mix of emotions flooding my chest. I had noticed the distance too, but I hadn't been able to put it into words like she had, and the way she expressed how deeply it affected her, how desperate she was to reach him, made me question everything. Had I been so wrapped up in my own world that I hadn't noticed the signs? Had we both failed him in some way? Reading this felt like a wake-up call. I had never seen my wife so vulnerable. She wrote that it was eating her up inside, not knowing how to fix it, how to make Caleb feel like he was truly part of this family. It was clear that the problem wasn't just about him, it was about all of us. I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as I read on. The way my wife expressed her worries about Caleb's isolation left me questioning whether I had truly been there for him. She wrote about how much she missed the boy he once was. The little boy who used to run into my arms after school, who would tell me everything about his day, and who would laugh without a care in the world. Where had that joyful, carefree kid gone? I had always assumed that the changes in Caleb were just part of growing up, that it was normal for him to start pulling away as he entered his teenage years. But reading my wife's words made me realize how deeply these changes were affecting her, and how deeply they were affecting him. My wife had tried to talk to him, but he had shut her out just as he had shut me out. There was a line in her writing that hit me the hardest. I feel like I'm losing him, and I don't know what to do anymore. Those words echoed in my mind as I sat there, staring at the page. It felt like a punch to the gut. Losing him? Was that what was happening? I had never imagined that my own son could feel this way, that he could be slipping through our fingers without us even realizing it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much my wife had been carrying. I had been so focused on my work, on the day-to-day grind of life, that I hadn't seen the toll it was taking on her and on Caleb. She had been silently bearing the burden of worrying about him, while I had been oblivious to her pain. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I knew I had to do better, for both of them. I couldn't just sit back and let my family fall apart without doing everything I could to fix it. But the question was, where do I even begin? The more I read, the more overwhelmed I felt. My wife had poured out her heart in that diary, each entry revealing a side of her that I had never fully understood. I always thought I was the one holding things together, that I was the pillar my family could rely on. But in truth, my wife had been doing the heavy lifting all along. She had been the one trying to maintain a sense of normalcy while Caleb pulled further and further away from us. And I had been too blind to see it. There was one particular entry that stood out to me. Caleb barely talks to me anymore. I try to engage, but all he does is nod or grunt. It's like there's a wall between us. He's becoming more distant, and it scares me. I don't know if it's just a phase or if something's really wrong. My wife's words echoed in my mind like a warning bell, reminding me of the importance of staying connected with our son. I realized that this wasn't just a passing phase for Caleb. There was something deeper going on, something I had failed to notice, perhaps because I had been too wrapped up in my own world. As much as I wanted to blame him for pushing us away, I couldn't ignore the fact that we had a part to play in this. I hadn't been the father he needed me to be. I hadn't been there when he needed me most. And that thought stung. The more I read, the more I understood why my wife had written what she did. She wasn't just worried about Caleb's behavior, she was terrified. She was terrified that she was losing him, terrified that we might never get him back. She wrote about the long nights she spent awake, wondering if she had done something wrong, if there was something more she could have done to help him. I knew I had to do something to change this, but what? Where did I start? The weight of what I was reading felt heavier with each passing minute. I couldn't shake the guilt that had begun to settle deep within me. My wife had been carrying this emotional burden on her own, and I had no idea. I had been so focused on my own issues, on work, on trying to keep everything running smoothly in the family, that I had failed to notice how much Caleb was struggling. I had always believed that being a good father meant providing for the family, being the one they could rely on for financial security and stability. But after reading my wife's diary, I realized that it wasn't just about providing material things. It was about being present, being emotionally available, and showing up when it mattered the most. One entry in particular hit me hard. I miss the old Caleb, the one who would laugh and joke with me, the one who would hug me and tell me everything was okay. Now, I feel like I'm living with a stranger. I don't know how to reach him anymore. I don't know what went wrong. I had seen the changes in Caleb, the withdrawn attitude, the mood swings, the quiet rebellion that seemed to be growing more intense by the day. But I had chalked it up to the typical teenage angst. I thought it was just a phase, something he would grow out of. I was wrong. What I hadn't realized until reading my wife's diary was that Caleb was not just going through a phase. He was struggling with something deeper, something that neither my wife nor I fully understood. And we weren't helping him by turning a blind eye. We had been ignoring the signs, hoping it would all just work itself out. But it wasn't. I couldn't help but think about all the missed opportunities, those moments when I could have stepped in and said something, done something to help him. But I had been too busy, too distracted by my own life. I sat there in silence, staring at the diary as the reality of it all sank in. I had been failing as a father, and the thought of it was suffocating. My son was hurting, and I had been too blind, too absorbed in my own world to see it. I had promised myself I would always be there for him, that I would always know what was going on in his life, but that promise had been broken long ago. The tears welled up in my eyes, but I quickly wiped them away. I couldn't afford to break down now. Caleb needed me, and I needed to find a way to fix things. I couldn't just sit here, reading my wife's thoughts, doing nothing. I had to act. The diary entries were painful to read, but they were also a wake-up call. They forced me to confront the reality of my own negligence. I could no longer ignore the signs of Caleb's pain. I had to face it head-on, no matter how uncomfortable it made me feel. One of the entries stood out, particularly because it mirrored something I had noticed myself, but had never given much thought to. Caleb doesn't want to talk to me anymore. He won't even look me in the eye. I feel like I've lost him, and I don't know how to get him back. I had thought it was just a phase, a typical part of growing up, but now I realized it was something much deeper. Caleb wasn't just pulling away, he was retreating into himself because he didn't feel like anyone understood him, and I had been too caught up in my own world to even notice. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I was the one who had failed him. I had been so busy focusing on my career and other responsibilities that I had forgotten the most important part of being a parent, to listen, to truly see my child and understand what they were going through. With a heavy heart, I closed the diary and stared at the wall, feeling the weight of my own shortcomings as a father. I had to do something, but the question was, where did I even begin? How could I make up for all the time I had wasted? How could I heal the growing distance between me and my son? The feeling of guilt was overwhelming, but it wasn't just about me. It was about Caleb. I had to find a way to show him that I cared, that I was truly there for him, no matter how much I had neglected him in the past. I had to find a way to show him that he wasn't alone. I thought about the times Caleb had reached out for my attention, only to be brushed off because I was too busy. There were so many moments when he needed me, but I wasn't there. My work, my problems, my distractions. None of them mattered now. It was about Caleb, and I couldn't waste any more time. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the first step was simple. I needed to talk to him. I needed to tell him that I was sorry, that I understood the hurt I had caused, and that I wanted to do better. But it had to be real. It couldn't just be words. I had to show him through my actions that I was committed to being a better father. But how would he respond? Would he even want to hear me out after all this time? The uncertainty was terrifying, but I couldn't let that stop me. I had to try. I waited for the right moment. It wasn't easy. Caleb was distant, avoiding eye contact whenever I tried to approach him. I saw the anger and disappointment in his eyes, but I also saw the deep sadness he tried so hard to hide. I knew it wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but I wasn't going to give up. I had to find a way to bridge the gap. One evening after dinner, I found Caleb sitting alone in the living room, staring at his phone. I walked in quietly, not wanting to startle him. I sat down next to him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Caleb," I said softly. He didn't look up, but I could tell he had heard me. I hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about things, about how I've been as a father." Caleb didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge my words, but I pressed on. "I've made a lot of mistakes, and I know I've hurt you. I'm really sorry for that. I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. I may not have shown it before, but I want to change that." Finally, he turned his head slightly, his eyes filled with a mixture of skepticism and vulnerability. "You want to change?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yes, I do. I've been selfish, and I've been blind to what really matters. I should have been there for you, and I wasn't. But I'm not going to sit by and let that be the end of it. I want to make it right." There was a long silence, and I wasn't sure if I was getting through to him. But then, Caleb let out a sigh, looking away. "I don't know if you can fix it all," he said quietly. "But I guess I'm willing to see if you can try." My heart swelled with both relief and hope. He was willing to give me a chance, and that was all I needed. Over the next few days, things between Caleb and I slowly began to shift. We didn't have any deep, heart-to-heart conversations immediately, but there was something different in the air. He was more open with me, even if it was just small talk, and I noticed him looking at me a little differently. It wasn't all fixed yet, but it felt like we were starting to rebuild. One evening, I decided to do something a bit out of the ordinary. Caleb had been spending most of his time in his room, and I knew he was having trouble letting go of everything that had happened. I walked into his room, where he was hunched over his desk, headphones in, lost in his music. "Hey," I said gently, not wanting to startle him. Caleb paused the music and looked up, surprised. "I was thinking," I began slowly, "how about we do something together this weekend? Just the two of us. We can go catch a movie or grab some food, whatever you want. It doesn't have to be anything crazy, but I'd like to spend some time with you, just talking and, well, being father and son." He stared at me for a moment, clearly processing my words. I could see the battle in his eyes. He wanted to say yes, but he was still guarded. After a beat, he shrugged, his expression softening slightly. "Sure, I guess. A movie sounds fine." The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming. It was a small step, but it was progress. He was willing to try, and that was all I needed to hear. I knew things wouldn't be perfect right away, but this was a start. The weekend came around quickly, and just like that, Caleb and I were sitting in a theater together, sharing popcorn, watching a movie we both enjoyed. There were moments of silence, but there were also moments when we shared a laugh, when we glanced at each other and exchanged knowing looks. It was the first time in a while that I felt like I was really with my son, and it was a feeling I didn't want to lose. As the weeks passed, Caleb and I continued to spend more time together, each time a little easier than the last. We started talking more openly about things, not just the big issues, but the little, everyday moments that usually go unnoticed. We still had some rough patches, and there were times when silence would creep back in, but it no longer felt as suffocating. I knew that we were making progress, even if it was slow. One afternoon, Caleb and I were sitting in the living room watching a basketball game when he suddenly spoke up, his voice quieter than usual. "Dad, do you think I'm messing up? I mean, with everything. With my life and with us?" His question caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him. There was an honesty in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. It was the same vulnerability I had witnessed in my wife's diary, the one she had written about him, the same vulnerability that made my heart break every time I thought about it. I paused before answering, taking a deep breath. "Caleb, listen to me. You're figuring things out, just like everyone else. We all make mistakes. What matters is that you keep going, that you don't give up on yourself. He nodded slowly, as if processing my words. I just don't want to let anyone down, you know? I placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. You're not going to let anyone down. You've already been through so much, but you're strong and you're learning, and no matter what happens, I'll always be here. I'll always support you, no matter where life takes you. For the first time in a long while, Caleb smiled at me, a small but genuine smile. Thanks, Dad, he said softly. And just like that, it felt like we were finally starting to understand each other. It wasn't going to be perfect, but I felt a sense of peace, knowing that we were moving in the right direction. The following months brought about more changes, some small and some larger, than I could have ever imagined. Caleb started to open up more about his dreams, his fears, his struggles, and his hopes for the future. He was no longer the same guarded teenager who felt lost in the chaos of his emotions. And I was no longer the man who kept everything bottled up inside, pretending like everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. We were finally able to communicate with each other in a way that felt real, vulnerable, and meaningful. One evening after dinner, Caleb and I found ourselves sitting on the porch, looking up at the stars. There was a calm in the air, a silence that didn't feel heavy, but instead peaceful. Dad, Caleb said, his voice almost a whisper, thanks for always being there, for sticking with me, even when I didn't deserve it. My heart swelled at his words. I could feel the weight of everything we had been through together, the highs and the lows, the moments of anger and frustration, but also the moments of tenderness and understanding. I'll always be here for you, Caleb. You're my son. Nothing changes that. Caleb smiled, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the stars above us. I know. He paused for a moment, as if contemplating something. I think Mom would be proud of how far we've come, don't you? I felt a lump form in my throat as I thought about my wife, her love, her strength, and her unwavering belief in us. Even though she wasn't physically there, I could feel her presence, her influence guiding us. I think she would, I said quietly. And just like that, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to lift. The broken pieces of our family, the hurt, the confusion, it all seemed to fall into place. We were healing, slowly but surely. And as I looked at Caleb, I realized something. Our story wasn't over. We had a long road ahead of us, but we were finally walking it together. This story reminds us that healing takes time, but with patience and love, anything is possible. If you've ever felt like things would never get better, remember that sometimes all it takes is a little effort, a lot of heart, and the willingness to keep going. Life is full of ups and downs, but when we learn to face them together, we become stronger. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others who might need a little inspiration. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on more heartwarming stories like this. Your support means everything. Thank you for being part of our journey.